might as well name a few of the disciplines that I think are particularly reprehensible to begin with. Obviously, I'm painting this with a very broad brush, and I'm not making the claim that every single person who engages in activity within all of these disciplines has been corrupted beyond comprehension by the postmodernist neo-Marxists, but it's close enough first pass approximation. So, as I said already, women's studies and all the ethnic studies and racial studies groups, man, those things have to go, and the faster they go, the better. They should have never been put...
Long-time subscribers will know I've made a fair few videos on Jordan Peterson going back over the last, I guess, 3 years at this point. And I've outlined my various problems with him in terms of his views on, like, women's rights and patriarchy, in terms of his views on things like addiction, and I feel like most importantly, his views on things like fascism and how I've described it before, rabid anti-leftism often makes him push fascist conspiracy theories, and the main one, of course, being the Cultural Marxism conspiracy theory, which of course has been quoted by extremely racist people in contemporary politics, but has a long racist history dating back to the 1930s. Now, this stuff's been covered before. It's also been covered by me before. But I thought what was an interesting angle is recently there was an undercover investigation into a group of neo-Nazis in New Zealand. And the investigation is well worth reading, and there's a lot of good insight into, like, specifically New Zealand's own problems with fascism. But there's a little quote right at the end by one of the members of this fascist cell, and he talks about Jordan Peterson. And I want to use that as like a jumping off point just to talk about Jordan Peterson's use to the far right, and then kind of end it with like him meeting up with Orban, and how this guy is just like a complete hypocrite. For someone who's so insanely paranoid about rising authoritarianism, he seems to not have much criticism for Western authoritarianism, whether that be Hungary or whether that be Israel. And to him, instead of real authoritarianism, the problem is actually some sort of fantasy land he lives in, where the real authoritarianism is using gender pronouns and taking English literature courses at university. So we're going to get into all of that today. I'm going to plug my social media for about a minute, so skip that if you're not interested. But before we get any further, a lot of my work on this channel is demonetized because when you're covering more serious, sometimes edgier topics, YouTube doesn't like this. So if you've ever enjoyed my work, please consider becoming a patron. And you don't have to pledge a crazy amount. I want to build up my Patreon based on as many people as possible pledging little amounts, like $1 or $2. So if you feel like I have ever brought anything that's worthwhile into your life and my content, please really consider becoming a patron to help me continue to do this, regardless of if YouTube monetize or not most of my videos in a given month. Also, if you want to join our communities, come check out our Discord and my subreddit. Those links in the description. And if you want to follow me personally, please check out the Kavernacle at Twitter, at Instagram, and also my personal Reddit, where you can keep up to date with all my content and what I'm doing. So once again, I'm filming at my girlfriend's house. I'll be back to the old set in my house next week. So this and one more video will be filmed here. So hopefully you guys don't mind the disturbance. If there's anything wrong with the picture quality or the sound quality, please let me know down in the comments. So I wanted to start this video by talking about these New Zealand fascists. So an article on critic.co.nz titled Fascism 2.0 Lessons from 6 Months in New Zealand's Largest White Supremacist Group. So this involves someone joining this white supremacist group undercover to expose them. So I just want to read the article. We're going to get a bit into like New Zealand fascism, and then we'll talk about the Jordan Peterson link right at the end. So the article says, fascism evolved. White supremacist groups in New Zealand are not new. Far-right, anti-Semitic and fascist ideas gained an organised following in New Zealand towards the end of the 20th century. The National Front and the National Socialist Party of New Zealand gained prominence in the early 70s. Skinhead Nazi gangs such as Unit 88 became active in the 90s. As time went on, the groups evolved and reformed. Kyle Chapman, former leader of the National Front, started the far-right white supremacist group Right Wing Resistance in 2009, Around the same time, the Dominion movement, a white supremacist group, grew in size. On the 15th of March 2019, a white supremacist terrorist killed 51 people in mass shootings at 2 mosques in Christchurch. There were connections between the attack and the rise of white supremacist extremism globally. Almost immediately, the far-right landscape transformed significantly. Research by Professor Paul Spoonley, who has studied the far-right of New Zealand for decades, and reporting by Giles Beckford from RNZ showed how these groups went underground and evolved. When the Dominion movement announced it had dissolved in the wake of the attacks, Action Zealandia emerged within months. Professor Spoonley highlighted the links between the Dominion movement and Action Zealandia. Senior members of Action Zealandia, particularly Zane, are preoccupied with the image of the organisation. They are paranoid about online chats being leaked, even when the discussion's a bit trivial. After members joked about marrying their relatives, Zane, who's someone who's involved in this group, demanded everyone delete their messages from the chat. Members stress that certain topics should only be talked about in person with trusted fellow members, suggesting that online chats are more sanitized and generally acceptable than their in-person conversation. Action Zealandia's ideology is based on the white genocide conspiracy theory, through which they portray themselves as protectors of Western civilization. Their discussions, on the other hand, reflect a simpler desire to restore the total power that they imagine straight, white, cisgender men once had through fascism. They describe individuals who share their beliefs as red-pilled, especially where those beliefs relate to what is described as the Jew question. In this context, someone is red-pilled if they share the belief that Jewish people are behind a sinister plot to eliminate white people and are to blame for the perceived decline of Western civilization. So this is very relevant to Jordan Peterson's belief in cultural Marxism, which we're going to get into. Every other group they hate fits into this worldview. They claim that this supposed Jewish cabal is responsible for the existence of the LGBTQ plus people, and the LGBTQ plus people are paedophiles in disguise. They claim black people are deliberately brought into white countries to cause conflict and violence. So we talked about something that's a bit more relevant to Jordan Peterson, so let's talk about the end of this article. Deplatforming works to slow the spread of hateful misinformation outside of extremist circles they form. Action Zealandia knows this. In their interview with the Nordic Resistance Movement, a Scandinavian neo-Nazi group responsible for multiple murders and bombings, Zane told an NRM representative his thoughts on deplatforming. Zane said that deplatforming isn't effective against people who are already committed fascists, but it does create a stopgap between a kid who is watching Jordan Peterson videos and our stuff. That stopgap is essential, but it's also fragile. It aims to stop the spread of their ideals, but doesn't stop existing members from posing a genuine threat to individual safety and national security. So I think it is extremely telling that a neo-Nazi involved in this prominent neo-Nazi group in New Zealand talks about deplatforming being the stopgap to get someone from Jordan Peterson videos to being a full-fledged neo-Nazi, right? And I've never claimed Jordan Peterson is a neo-Nazi, is a member of the alt-right, but I think this is so telling because of the stuff Jordan Peterson peddles. Now, these guys clearly believe in some sort of like Judeo-Bolshevism / cultural Marxism conspiracy theory. It's kind of like a combination of the two, it seems. Now, anti-communism has always had pretty anti-Semitic undertones because of Karl Marx's heritage being Jewish, numerous members of the Bolsheviks being Jewish as well. And also you have books like The Protocols of the Elders of Zion coming out in 1903, which was eventually published in English in 1919 with the help of people like Henry Ford, who obviously owned Ford Motors and was a massive anti-Semite. But with the Russian Revolution, people's problems with Judaism seemed to come to fruition, and they believed communism was just the front for the Jewish conspiracy to take over the world. So Judeo-Bolshevism was a key part of the Nazis' ideology. Elders of the Protocols of Zion was taught to children in school in Nazi Germany. And for the Nazis, essentially, the war of the Soviet Union was a race war. Not only a race war against Slavs and various Asian people who fought for the Soviet Union, it was also a race war against either Jewish Bolsheviks or a whole army which was in control of this Jewish conspiracy. Now, I want to clarify something quickly because people keep saying to me, you're wrong about cultural Marxism, because I've been using cultural Marxism as a term for the conspiracy theory. But what we're really talking about here is the cultural Marxism conspiracy. Sometimes I say cultural Marxism. I get how that is wrong and that might be confusing. Cultural Marxism exists. It's a thing. It's a belief. But the conspiracy theory is that this is a dominant belief in academia, in various institutions of power, and it has taken over like global institutions and stuff. This belief about bringing Marxism in through challenging cultural institutions, and this goes back to the Frankfurt School in the 1930s. These group of philosophers who fled Nazi Germany and moved to America and had very liberal views for the time on race, on gender, on sexuality and things like this. And people attribute a lot of this to Gramsci. He talks about pushing Marxism through like cultural institutions. So, troublingly, the old Attorney General of the UK and also Boris Johnson believe in fighting cultural Marxism. So this article by the New Statesman, What is Cultural Marxism, says, cultural Marxism is a theory that started in the early 20th century, which was popularised in the aftermath of the Socialist Revolution in Russia. The idea was that Marxism should extend beyond class and into cultural equality, and that through major institutions like schools and the media, cultural values could progressively be changed. The theory was later adopted by the philosophers at the Frankfurt School, who posited that the only way to destroy capitalism was to destroy it in all walks of life, where not just classes, but all genders, races, and religions could live in society equally. The Frankfurt School's adoption and modifications to cultural Marxism is where the conspiracy theory truly begins. The Frankfurt School's predominantly Jewish members of the school were forced to flee to America by the Nazis in the 40s, where many went on to teach, write, and commentate in the mainstream institutions. This, conspiracy theorists claim, is when cultural Marxists began to poison the West and when cultural Marxists began their attempts to undermine its values. Cultural Marxism's move from political theory to full memefication was fast-tracked when it was used by mass murderer Anders Breivik. Breivik was the sole perpetrator of the 2011 Norway terrorist attacks. Before committing his attacks, much like the Christchurch shooter, Breivik sent an enormous personal manifesto to a group of friends and family which outlined his anti-multicultural, racist and misogynist views. In his manifesto, he spends huge chunks of time crediting the writers who pushed the cultural Marxism conspiracy theories into the mainstream. It refers to this about 650 times. For the growing audience of the alt-right white supremacists online, his musings turn him into an icon, and cultural Marxism has become a foundation of alt-right belief. Now, anti-fascists and general critics of the far-right weren't just talking about this in the wake of the Norway attacks, they were actually talking about this before, and there's an article by the splcenter.org, Cultural Marxism Catching On, which details this rise in America of far-right, right-wing politicians and figures using cultural Marxism to kind of galvanize people. And this was in 2003 they were talking about this. So the article says, like Jews in general, the Frankfurt School makes a convenient antagonist, one that is basically seen as antithetical to all things American. The school, says social psychology professor Richard Lichman of the Berkeley-based Wright Institute, says, is a convenient target that very few people really know anything about. Goes on to say, by grounding their critique in Marxism and using the Frankfurt School, cultural conservatives make it seem like it's quite foreign to anything American. It takes on a mysterious cast and translates as an incomprehensible anti-American foreign movement that is only interested in undermining the US. The idea being transmitted is that we are being infected from the outside. So can you begin to get the sense of why fascists love Jordan Peterson? Now I want to play you these two clips I've shared before, right? So Jordan Peterson's main battle as this professor, this academic, is tackling what he sees as cultural Marxism in academia. And in Jordan Peterson's view, because the Marxists lost the Cold War, they've tried to infiltrate different institutions in the West, mainly academia, to spread their beliefs to vulnerable Western children, right? So in universities, everyone is being brainwashed, essentially, if you take a specific type of course, for example. Now, here he is in a speech talking about what university is for, how people are being brainwashed, and what sort of courses he sees as, sort of doing this leftist brainwashing.
The universities have figured out how to conspire, in some sense, to pick the future pockets of the students that they're purporting to educate, and they're not educating them, they're indoctrinating them. They're not teaching them how to speak, they're not teaching them how to debate, they're not teaching them how to write, they're not introducing them to the classical wisdom of the Western Judeo-Christian tradition. And that's absolutely appalling, because that's what the bloody institution was there for to begin with, and that's what it's supposed to be doing. And so what people need to do in order to know that they should stop taking the courses is to know what it is that these courses are aiming at. So that needs to be explained. Then they need to know what language the people who teach these courses are using in order to fulfill those aims. Then they need to know how to identify the courses. Then they need to know that it's in their best interest, both, I would say, spiritually and economically, to avoid those courses and those disciplines like the plague. And then maybe we can get the disciplines that have become entirely corrupt and the ones that started that way to put themselves back together before they run themselves out of existence completely. And I might as well name a few of the disciplines that I think are particularly reprehensible to begin with. Obviously, I'm painting this with a very broad brush, and I'm not making the claim that every single person who engages in activity within all of these disciplines has been corrupted beyond comprehension by the postmodernist neo-Marxists, but it's close enough first pass approximation. So, as I said already, women's studies and all the ethnic studies and racial studies groups, man, those things have to go, and the faster they go, the better. They should have never been put... It would have been better had they never been part of the university to begin with, as far as I can tell. Sociology, that's corrupt. Anthropology, that's corrupt. English literature, that's corrupt. Maybe the worst offender are the faculties of education.
Now, isn't that lovely? He's railing against brainwashing while saying, you know, universities should be there to teach the Judeo-Christian classical tradition. Now, I've made whole videos about how Judeo-Christian is often just a white supremacist dog whistle because it actually doesn't make any sense. And that term together, like a lot of the terms Jordan Peterson uses, like postmodern neo-Marxist, which literally is an oxymoron that doesn't make sense, talking about Judeo-Christian classical tradition doesn't make sense because, first of all, Judeo-Christian, that is not one set of beliefs or ideology. Judaism as a religion is very different from Christianity, and I said this before, the main tormentor of Jewish people have been Christians, and the only reason this term has become more prominent is because the emergence of Israel as being part of this, Western bloc in the Cold War. It's something that became more prominent under Eisenhower to make it more inclusive because, of course, even during the Cold War and even when the US became great allies with Israel, US anti-Semitism was rife. You had prominent people like Senator Joe McCarthy, JFK's dad, loads of prominent people in America absolutely did not like Jewish people, but this was a movement to do that stuff. But then you also have, how is Judeo-Christian the same as classical? Classical implies Rome or Greece, these pagan societies. And even if we're talking about the Enlightenment, which kind of looks back to this time, most of the figures in the Enlightenment weren't traditional Christians. Like if you talk about the Founding Fathers in America, obviously, I don't like the Founding Fathers in America for all their genocidal racist policies, but a lot of these people were unconventional Christians. They were deists. There is speculation some of them were atheists. Thomas Jefferson edited the Bible to take all references to miracles out of it. Imagine someone like Barack Obama doing that today or something. So that is a term that does not make any sense, but it's also what Western chauvinists say. So Jordan Peterson is a Western chauvinist, and he's saying this stuff like, don't brainwash kids into leftism, brainwash them into Judeo-Christian Western values. That's what universities should do. Also, I love all the courses he lists as well, like English literature, ethnic studies, women's studies, or gender studies. I think it shows an authoritarian side to him. And this is a guy who absolutely claims to hate authoritarianism, talking about banning all these courses and everything. That sounds very authoritarian. But it's very telling Jordan Peterson talks about the Judeo-Christian classical tradition, because in his mind, the cultural Marxists are undermining this. The cultural Marxists who infiltrate academia are destroying Western culture. And obviously he became famous for his stand on pronouns, but he sees this as all part of the same movement. Socialism, feminism, and even things like trans rights. Just like the fascists in Europe, just like the fascists in New Zealand, just like fascists in general, social change done by the left is actually a conspiracy theory by Marxists. And most of the time these people also believe these Marxists are actually in control of the Jewish conspiracy. Now, the difference with Jordan Peterson is for someone who claims, to be a massive anti-fascist, and he also hates, socialism as well, is Peterson does not credit this to Jewish people, right? The cultural Marxism conspiracy he pushes is not, explicitly anti-Semitic. I mean, it still is pretty anti-Semitic if you're even talking about this stuff, because we know the history. But his version doesn't have Jewish people. But that's what this neo-Nazi Zane was saying. The deplatforming provides a stopgap from Jordan Peterson fans becoming more radicalised to becoming neo-Nazis. But when you're pushing a conspiracy theory that really has its roots in anti-Semitism and is also an extension of what the Nazis believed in, Judeo-Bolshevism, it's very, very similar. And it's not surprising that actual neo-Nazis would say that Jordan Peterson is part of his pipeline to becoming an actual neo-Nazi. And Jordan Peterson is just delusional and paranoid about all these things. And even just talking about the Frankfurt School and everything just really shows you his beliefs and how he actually has bought in to an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. Whether that is unwittingly or not, I can't really comment on. I'd imagine he doesn't believe it's anti-Semitic, but it clearly is. So just like with what that neo-Nazi was saying, it isn't much of a jump to go from cultural Marxism to the cultural Marxism that the Jews are pushing, and then Judeo-Bolshevism, which fascists traditionally believing about this Jewish conspiracy to take over the world. Now, Jordan Peterson, like I said, claims to hate authoritarianism. He also met with Orban in Hungary, who is like this model for fascists in the West of how to create like a contemporary sort of fascist-leaning society, and authoritarian fascists at that. And obviously Tucker Carlson recently went there and was promoting how great Hungary was. Now, obviously Jordan Peterson met him as well. So this article by Eric Levitz talks about this, and it says, Viktor Orban is a nationalist, one who strives to protect his people from the dangerous speech of foreign individuals who do not share their group identity. The Hungarian Prime Minister believes that his country is not a simple sum of individuals, but a community that needs to be organised, strengthened and developed. Thus, in 2014, he explained that the new state that we are building is an illiberal state, a non-liberal state, which is to say the government will crack down on any political activists, NGOs and civil organisations that promote foreign interests within Hungary. Orban has made good on this promise through punitive laws and belligerent propaganda. The Prime Minister forced a Central European university, a liberal institution whose avowed purpose was to protect the open society from authoritarianism, to withdraw from Hungary. At the nation's remaining colleges, Orban has banned fields of study that conflict with the state's conception of truth. And while Orban identifies as an illiberal Democrat, his party has insulated its power against the threat of a popular rebuke to such a degree that many scholars describe his regime as a creeping dictatorship. Now, you can probably see why Jordan Peterson likes this guy. Jordan Peterson's talking about banning all these fields of studies which promotes anti-Western views. Well, Orban has actually done this in practice. It's like Jordan Peterson's wet dream right there. Then it goes on to talk about Peterson meeting him. Peterson was in Budapest to speak at the Brain Bar Festival when Orban invited the author to join him in a discussion of current political issues. Peterson accepted. That Orban-friendly news outlet Hungary Today described their meeting as an amiable conversation about the dangers of illegal immigration, political correctness, and Jean-Claude Juncker's apologies for Karl Marx. The paper said Peterson and Orban also touched on the current tendency to minimise the crimes committed under communist regimes. So NY Mag goes on to say, and yet if Peterson's behaviour in Budapest is incompatible with his beliefs, they're not entirely out of character. Like many of his fellow Denzians of the intellectual dark web, Peterson has long evinced less concern about right-wing governments that are currently using state power to achieve illiberal ends than about left-wing college students who could theoretically do so in future, assuming they take their rhetoric to what Jordan Peterson sees their logical conclusion. When Israel's right-wing government uses state power to officially discriminate between different categories of legal residents on the basis of religion or to deny basic political rights to those it rules in the occupied territories, Peterson feels little need to speak out. In fact, he suggested that the harshest critics of Israel's illiberalism are motivated by anti-Semitism. So the guy who pushes the cultural Marxism conspiracy theory is saying critics of Israel are actually all anti-Semites. When transgender teenagers on a college campus demand that their professors use their preferred pronouns, Peterson warns that such illiberal activities threaten to revive the Marxist doctrines that killed at least 100 million people in the 20th century. Meanwhile, it isn't hard to see how Peterson and Orban might see eye to eye. The latter has effectively banned gender studies, which I showed you in that clip, Jordan Peterson wants to do as well, from his nation's universities, while the former has called on his nation to do the same. What's more, in a diatribe that Orban's speechwriters may wish to crib from, Peterson went so far as to suggest that left-wing instructors at Canadian teachers' colleges should be prosecuted for crimes against the state. The Ontario Institute for the Studies of Education, that bloody thing is a fifth column, he said in 2017. The people who are producing the educators that emerged from that institute, they should be put on trial for treason, like it's serious stuff. The idea that the purpose of education is to get them while they're young in kindergarten, so this radical postmodern Marxist ideology, they're so thoroughly calculated when they're young, they have no chance of escaping from it, and that's what's happening in the education system. The article goes on to say, if you're going to popularise the idea that leftist academics and human rights organisations are poisoning the minds of children and fomenting a subversive ideology antithetical to the health of your nation, then you simply cannot meet with an authoritarian prime minister who's used nearly the identical arguments to justify state crackdowns on independent universities and NGOs. So Western chauvinists don't usually care so much about supposed Western values of free speech and freedom in general. They kind of like authoritarianism to protect what they perceive as Western values. Now, Jordan Peterson, I just find him a bit ridiculous as this, academic, right? His arguments often don't make any sense. He's delusional. But you can see why this guy is such a useful tool to neo-Nazis, right? And he's talking about indoctrination. People who listen to Jordan Peterson are indoctrinated in far-right conspiracy theories that Nazis love and Nazis use. And when you see someone like Orban, who is like the face of parliamentary, governmental, far-right authoritarianism in the West, and he actually uses very similar rhetoric to you, and he actually does things that you're asking for, and you're meant to be anti-authoritarianism, but you're saying ban gender studies. Orban did that. You're saying crack down on leftist universities. Orban did that. So to me, Jordan Peterson really has no value whatsoever, and I actually have always found him very, very dangerous because his self-help stuff is ridiculous, especially because he can't seem to follow it himself when he puts all the blame on the individual. And while I believe addiction is a lot of the time a societal issue, Jordan Peterson usually just believes it's an individual issue. And that makes it all the more hypocritical, is that he's a guy who has struggled really badly with addiction in his life. And then his politics are nonsensical, but also they're dangerous because he just helped mainstream a far-right conspiracy theory, right? Now you get lots of more centrist people talking about cultural Marxism. Now it's acceptable for the Prime Minister of the UK to want to fight against cultural Marxism, the Attorney General of the UK to fight against cultural Marxism, despite this term coming into the mainstream news with Breivik, but now it's been mainstream with Jordan Peterson, and the only thing he leaves out, that the plot by the leftists is actually being run by this Jewish conspiracy. But then it's not hard to jump to that conclusion for a lot of people if you get further radicalised, because it's only one step. You believe that leftists are working as this conspiracy to undermine the West. You have a guy like Jordan Peterson saying that fighting for progressive change is part of this conspiracy theory. So then if you buy into that ridiculous concept, then is it so hard to believe these people will then buy into the masterminds behind this is some sort of Jewish conspiracy pushing this? Because as fascists have always believed, the Jews are the one trying to undermine Western society, Christian values, family values, all that other shit. So it's not surprising these New Zealand neo-Nazis believe this stuff about Peterson. So anyway, let me know what you guys think down in the comments. If you want to follow me on social media, at the Kavernacle on Twitter and on Instagram. If you want to join our communities, Discord and subreddit. If you want to support my work on Patreon, stuff like this is demonetized. Please check that out, also in the description, and if you made it this far, thank you all for watching.